We're live.
Okay, we're live. Okay, well, hello and welcome to this live panel discussion hosted by me, Will Hunt.
And me, Charlie Mackintosh.
Over the next hour and a half, we're going to be speaking to an array of guests, but before Charlie outlines what we'll be talking about, I just wanted to say thank you very much to everyone who is watching, everyone who's in the live chat. If you want to ask any questions or make any comments based on what our panelists say, please feel free to do that. And also a big thank you to Keris and Thea Osborne, who are behind the scenes helping with the technology, and hopefully it should all go fine.
So over the next hour, we will be speaking to this panel of four guests, each representing one of the four main English political parties, and discussing what we think the United Kingdom will look like in the post-COVID world. We're going to be discussing the government's handling of the crisis, the impact on education, issues surrounding vaccines, the economy, and looking at how this event could change UK politics forever.
Now, it's a great honour to introduce you to our four panellists who are joining us for this discussion. Firstly, the Right Honourable Jackie Smith. After working as a teacher in Worcestershire, Jackie was elected as the Labour MP for Redditch in 1997, after holding various ministerial positions, including serving as Chief Whip and Minister for Schools under Tony Blair. Jackie was made Gordon Brown's Home Secretary and held the office until 2009. She was the first woman to not be called Margaret to hold one of the highest offices of state. So, Jackie, welcome.
Secondly, I'd like to introduce the Right Honourable Baroness Natalie Bennett, who, after spending the first part of her life in Australia, moved to the United Kingdom in 1999 and became a journalist, working variously for The Guardian, The Independent and The Times. She's been an active member of the Green Party for much of her adult life, and in 2012, Natalie became the party leader, serving until 2016. In 2019, she was given a life peerage and is now one of the two Green Party peers sitting in the House of Lords. Natalie, welcome.
Also, Lord Chris Fox. After graduating from Imperial College London, where he was president of the Student Union, Chris worked as a petroleum engineer in the Middle East. Later in his career, he became director of corporate communications for several companies, including Tate & Lyle. Throughout this time, he has been active in Lib Dem politics. In 1994, he became a councillor, and in 2009 became Director of Policy for the party and later Chief Executive. He was made a life peer in 2014. Chris, welcome.
Finally, we have Mark Garnier MP. After leaving school, Mark joined the London Stock Exchange as a junior clerk, before going on to join a succession of banks and later becoming Managing Director of South China Securities. Between 1999 and 2005, Mark worked as an independent hedge fund manager while serving as a Conservative councillor. In 2010, he was elected as the Member of Parliament for Wyre Forest and has served on the Treasury Select Committee before serving as the International Trade Minister from 2016 to 2018. Mark was returned in 2019 with a majority of over 20,000 votes and continues to represent Wyre Forest.
Well, thank you very much for all of you for agreeing to be part of this panel discussion. We really do appreciate it. I wondered, Mark, if I could maybe start my first question with you, talking a little bit about the government's handling of the pandemic. Now, the pandemic has hit the United Kingdom hard. Over 46,000 people have died, and the UK has the highest, or the second highest, death per capita ratio of any country in Europe. Bearing this in mind, in your opinion, has the Conservative government dealt with the public health crisis well?
Well, one of the problems about anything like this is that there's no real sort of game book that you can follow when you start trying to handle this type of thing. And I think when we have the inquiry that goes into this, and there will inevitably be a very, very extensive inquiry, I think there will be quite a lot of mistakes that have been made. But I think we have to look at those mistakes in the context of what was known at the time and the decisions that were made, given we knew where we were at the time. I think one of the things they got right is creating a huge amount of capacity within the NHS. So you'll see we've built 9 of these Nightingale hospitals. There was a major rethink about what was going on in hospitals in terms of making sure those hospitals could handle the crisis. The lockdown was probably a bit slow. I think we shouldn't have had the Cheltenham Festival in retrospect. We shouldn't have had that football match in Liverpool. There were those kind of obvious things which I think we got wrong. But I think that when we come out of this, there are going to be a number of questions that are going to be asked. I mean, one of which I think is, in our enthusiasm to build up the capacity in the NHS, have we unwittingly created another problem in other parts of the health system? And what's interesting is we're now looking at rebuilding our health service in terms of bringing it back to normal, to get people to come and start having cancer care, for example, and normal elective treatments. And I think one of the problems we're going to find is that actually we've created by creating this capacity for COVID-19, we've created other problems further down the line for other people who maybe weren't getting the care they should have done at the time. And secondly, I think we're going to find it more difficult to go back to normal within the NHS than perhaps we imagined it was going to be. So I think there's going to be a lot of mistakes that we're going to identify. But as I say, it's not an easy thing to do, to handle a crisis where you don't really know kind of what the characteristics are and what's going to happen. And we've never had a live test of this in any meaningful sense since 1918, when we had the Spanish flu crisis.
Do you not agree, though, Mark, that the United Kingdom had the same level of information, if not a greater level of information, about the incoming pandemic as our European counterparts, and yet the United Kingdom's handling of it seems to have been worse than everyone's except Belgium?
Well, everybody's come up with sort of different ideas. So if you look at the Nordic countries, some of the Nordic countries have tried different approaches. We've seen, kind of early lockdowns. We've seen, we don't really know quite what's going on in China as well, by the way. Charlie, sorry to get the name right. But again, I think what we need to do is, before sort of trying to pass judgment on this, we really do need to sort of look at this holistically. But I'm the first person to accept that there have been mistakes made. I'm not going to try to pretend that this has been an exemplary example of a government leaping in to try to resolve this. I think we do have to accept the mistakes. And what's really important is this could happen again. And if we are not entirely honest with the analysis of what we did right and what we did wrong, then we will not be prepared or better prepared for the next pandemic when that arrives at some point in the future.
Yeah. Okay. Jackie, I just wonder if we could maybe bring you in here. Do you agree with a lot of what Mark has said?
Yes, I do. And interestingly, when I was Home Secretary back in 2007, I was responsible for the government's risk register. So this was how we worked out as a government what we thought the biggest risks for the country were, both in terms of likelihood and the impact that they would have. And number one on the risk register was a pandemic. And I think it would probably be fair to say that given that that was top of the government's risk register, all governments since then perhaps didn't put in place the preparation that was necessary in order to respond to it when 10, 12 years later, here we are with a pandemic. I largely agree with the areas of sort of weakness that Mark mentioned as well. I do think it's probably the biggest crisis that any politician of my generation has had to deal with. So I felt reasonably sympathetic to politicians as they've gone through this, less sympathetic to their advisors who didn't seem to be able to follow the lockdown rules, but pretty sympathetic to those who were taking the decisions. And I also agree, and one of the other things I do now is that I'm chair of the University Hospitals Birmingham NHS Trust that runs the QE, and in fact developed one of the Nightingale hospitals that Mark was referring to. And he's absolutely right that one of the biggest challenges now, almost bigger than dealing with the first part of the crisis, is how we get our services back up and running again so that we can be treating people with the less immediately urgent conditions, but which if we don't treat them will end potentially. I think there was a report just today suggesting that potentially there could be as many or more deaths from delayed treatments in the NHS as there have been from COVID. That's a massive challenge for the NHS, and it's going to be very difficult for staff in the coming months.
And Jackie, you're chair of that trust. What sort of support would you like to see from the government maybe to help you make that challenge a bit easier?
I think we will, I'm afraid, need a bit more money to enable us to reconfigure the way that we are organising our care. So we've got 4 hospitals in the trust. We've made one of them and part of another one a non-COVID zone. That means that we've got considerably less capacity, as well as our staff, of course, having to spend more time putting on, taking off PPE. So we're going to need some money. I think we're going to need some understanding and the ability to get on with it at a local level across Birmingham and Solihull, rather than constant sort of interference. But largely, to be fair, I think the government is listening to that. I hope Rishi Sunak is listening to the bit about the money as well. But certainly up to this point, money hasn't been a particular problem. What's been more of a problem is getting the staff, getting the changes made quickly enough. At the beginning, getting the PPE and things like that.
Very interesting. Now, Lord Fox, of course, feel free to comment on anything that's already been said, but we wanted to ask you specifically, as the Liberal Democrat Lord spokesperson on business, energy and industrial strategy, do you think that the government has done enough to support the key sectors that your role covers, especially small businesses?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, and well done, Will and Charlie, on organising this event. Thanks for inviting us. I think yes and no is the answer. I think the furlough scheme, as far as it's gone, has been a good way of holding people in employment or close to employment. The challenge that we're seeing today and going forward is what happens as that furlough unwinds. But there's a whole group of self-employed people and people, small business people, who've been missed out by the Chancellor's measures, and millions of people. And so whilst I think the media has congratulated the Chancellor and the government on its performance, I think it has forgotten. There is a group of people who've been forgotten. Coming back to the wider question, and I'm happy to go into that more detail as we go through, but coming back to the wider question, in my corporate life, I was in charge of crisis management, and the key element for crisis management is clear, consistent messaging. Now, I was out in the countryside yesterday on a long walk, and I bumped into lots of people, not literally, and I saw the entire range of behaviours. I saw people who were so nervous that they cowered into the bushes as you walked by. And I saw people who were so obviously reckless, they just didn't care, and they brushed you as they came by. And this wasn't divided by age. It wasn't divided by class or socioeconomic. It was about the disposition of the individuals. And the problem, I think, that we're in now is that the messages are so mixed that every individual can pick the message they want to justify the behavior that they now have. And I think the challenge as we go into the winter and as we go forward must be for the government to clarify that message. And the one other issue is validating the point that Jackie made about health. I hosted a meeting of Macmillan activists who were talking about cancer care. And it's absolutely clear that large swathes of cancer care have dropped off the planet. And there is really urgent care that's not happening for people. And in the end, the death toll and the human misery that will be caused by that may not be equal to what we've seen from the virus, but it's going to be equivalent and really very serious.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that, Lord Chris Fox. I just wondered, maybe, Natalie, maybe we could ask you some questions based on this. Now, your party said repeatedly throughout the government's handling of the crisis that you don't think their economic response has gone far enough, and your party is signalling to those key dates, you know, when the furlough scheme ends, and talking about what potentially the damage could be then. I just wondered, what's your personal opinion on it? Would you agree with much of what your party said?
Very much so. I mean, to sort of trace through what we've said thus far, first of all, I'm going to agree with Mark on one thing, which is that we can't judge what was decisions that were made in March or April based on what we know about the virus now. We know a lot more about the virus. And you do have to be careful in the inevitable post-mortem to be looking at, you know, what we knew at that point. I was actually in Westminster at that time, that last nervous week when the rest of the country was in lockdown and the Lords was still sitting. And, you know, there was lots of things we were much more concerned then about transmission by surfaces, whereas now we're much more focused on aerosol transmission and ventilation and those kind of issues. So things have changed, and that's not the government's fault. That's just the nature of a new disease. But where the Green Party's been critical and where I've been critical is three main areas of things that are structural and, if you like, ideological. And the first of all is what the reaction has been heavily privatised. And we've seen again and again how disastrous privatisation of public services is. And, you know, we're seeing with the national track and trace system that's going very poorly, all the endless horror stories we're hearing about large numbers of people being paid to sit around and do nothing, do quizzes and barbecues. And while we've got local public health people, NHS and council people, who are tearing their hair out because they know how to act on a local level, particularly in places where we've got hotspots. But the government has just handed everything over to the private sector, as well as, of course, of things like the procurement of PPE. Secondly, there's also the fact that associated with that is a centralisation. Instead of saying different local areas really know what's happening in their area, there's been an attempt to control everything from the centre, and that's very much a tendency of this government. And thirdly, this sounds kind of slightly counter to what Chris was just saying, but there's been a terrible oversimplification, an idea that the public can only understand really simple messages involving 2 or 3 words. Whereas by contrast, if you look very early on, there was a great video of Angela Merkel explaining to the country what the R number was, what it meant, what this meant German people had to do. And there you had, the head of the government really soberly expecting German people to listen, to understand, to be able to make choices for themselves. And I think the government has really failed. They've either said something safe or it's not safe. Whereas the fact, there's no such thing as absolute safety. If they had more nuanced, not looking for simple 3-word slogans like take back control or get Brexit done, but really trusted the public and explained things better, it would have worked much better. But just finally, in terms of the sort of the economics and the people's situations, so many people have fallen through the cracks, as Chris was alluding to. Small businesses who didn't have the 3 years of records, people who were caught missed out on the furlough scheme because they were just in the middle of changing jobs in a vital week or two, absolutely no fault of their own, totally stuck. The hashtags new starter furlough. And so, the problem here is underlying the problem of conditionality. If you have conditional benefits, then people will fall through the cracks, which is why we've always advocated for a universal basic income. And, in the recovery phase, we're talking potentially about a recovery universal basic income. So no one gets missed out, no one gets left with no money.
Yeah, Charlie, I think you have a...
Well, yes, to link what you were saying we'll go to Jackie in a second, but to Mark. Natalie, it seemed then that you were advocating that one of the main reasons for the United Kingdom's failure to deal with the crisis successfully is other European nations, like perhaps Germany, or indeed South Korea, which is not a European nation, was the fact that there's a great deal of privatization in the National Health Service. Mark, do you agree with the diagnosis that this has been one of the major problems, or do you think this has been a benefit in helping the United Kingdom deal with the crisis?
Well, in terms of having parts of the NHS privatised?
Yes.
Well, the whole argument about the privatisation of the NHS is quite a complicated one, and actually it's one that I think is become extraordinarily confused, and people don't really quite understand what it means. I mean, there has been an element within this pandemic that a number of things like cancer care, for example, within the Worcestershire Acute Hospital Trust, so where obviously King's Worcester has been passed out to the private sector. So where they want to create the capacity within the NHS, they pass some of that urgent care goes to the private sector. But I think the privatisation argument about the NHS is a very, very complicated and quite difficult one. And actually, there's a very good example that I use when I'm trying to explain it to people is actually what happened, Jackie, under your government, when in Kidderminster Hospital there was knee and hip replacements were put out under I think it's Interhealth, who took it on. And in fact, although that was technically sort of privatisation, actually it was NHS doctors with NHS nurses using NHS hospitals, NHS theatres, NHS kit, but the Interhealth were essentially taking on the financial risk. Now, as it turned out, it kind of wasn't right. But the point is, it feels in every sense to the consumer that that they are using the patients, that is, they're using the NHS, and actually they are using it in the sense that it's intended to be, which is free to all at the point of delivery. So I think the sort of privatisation argument of the NHS is a bit of a slightly different one. I think the point that Natalie was making in terms of things like trying to deal with the track and trace system, and now these people phoning up. I mean, I think the average track and tracer is making, is it 2.5 calls a day or something? There was an interesting comment by Rupert Soames, who's I think is the head of Carillion, this morning, who was talking about exactly this. And he sort of rather likened it, and again, we need to analyse this in the inquiry, but he rather likened it to the Nightingale hospitals, none of which were actually used. But the point is, what you would rather have is spare capacity rather than excess demand. So we need to, again, have a look at this. But again, getting back to the app that was designed for the Isle of Wight, that manifestly didn't work. And I think, again, I have to put my hands up and say the government has made a lot of mistakes. But we've really got to get this right in terms of the inquiry afterwards to make sure we learn from these errors and the successes, by the way.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Jackie, you had a point you wanted to make.
And then we'll go to you, Chris.
One of the points that I wanted to make was that, and this is as we begin to think about the impact of COVID and how we deal with it, is, what this pandemic has proven to us is that where there are inequalities in society, they are massively exacerbated by something like this. So, for example, we know now that there has been a disproportionate impact of COVID, both certainly on both catching it and on whether or not you're more or less likely to die from it, depending on your race. And there are some communities that have been disproportionately impacted. And also, of course, you're disproportionately impacted if you've got other conditions. So if you're overweight, if you've got diabetes, and things like that. And I've all long argued that actually inequalities are a key determinant of how healthy you're going to be, almost more important than how good the treatment is once you get into hospital. Because where you start from, your poverty levels, where you live, the colour of your skin will be likely to determine what diseases you get. And I think we're going to have to think much more seriously about how we address those health inequalities. In Birmingham, for example, we've identified that actually if you travel just 7 stops on the train track, the age at which you're likely to die shortens by nearly 10 years. Now, that is not because of the quality of the hospitals, because they're all run by the trust that I'm responsible for. It's simply because of the way that people have to live, the money that they've got, the conditions that they've got, the health of their surroundings and the conditions that they've already got. So that's one point. The other thing I'd say about, as we, Mark and Natalie, I think rightly have focused on small businesses and whether or not the economic support has been flexible enough. The other thing I don't think it's recognised is, and the suggestion is that actually women have been impacted harder by the lockdown than men. One of the reasons for that is because actually women still tend to do more of the childcare. And there's been an assumption, sometimes by the Prime Minister on a Sunday night, that you go back to work on a Monday with very little thought whatsoever for childcare and other issues. And my feeling about that is actually, if there'd been a few more women around that top table, advising, if there'd been a little bit more diversity in the people that were making the decisions, somebody would have said, just a minute, Prime Minister, it might be a good idea if, as well as trying to get the pubs open, we try and get childcare provision back in place as well before we go ahead with that. I like a pub, but I would probably have noticed the childcare as well.
Thank you, Jackie. Just briefly, Chris, if you just want to make your point before we
I'll be as incisive as I can. Really coming back to Natalie's point about local versus central, which she's dead right on. And this comes on top of 10 years of very serious cutbacks on local government. And obviously some of that happened in the coalition government, and but a large swathe of that has happened in the last 5 years, which has kind of really taken a huge lump of capability out of local government. And again, Natalie used the example of Germany, and one of the reasons that Germany has been able to succeed, and one of the big reasons, is it has very strong regional and local government. So it had the agency to implement its policies. So it's all very well pulling a lever in Whitehall, but if that lever is not attached to anything, nothing happens. And I think that's sort of what we've been seeing on our side. Whereas in Germany, because of the land and because of the regional government and because of a strong, essentially bureaucratic approach, that they've been able to deliver policy in a much more successful way. And I think we couldn't have just handed things over to local government as local government stood 4 months ago, because local government had been denuded of capability. So I think one of the things we have to take forward from this is what really can be done locally much better, and how do we resource that properly from the central government? Because it's all very well central government saying do stuff, but if they don't give them the money to do it, they can't do it.
So thank you very much, Chris. Now I think there's a desire from the chat to move on to discussing the future rather than the last 6 months, which everyone is naturally, I think, at this point a bit sick of lockdown and discussing it. But we have a question from Lloyd Arnold, who is asking, a decade on from the 2008 financial crash, many commentators have described it as a missed opportunity to bring about economic change, or just general change. Will the same be said of the ongoing pandemic in 10 years' time? Anyone want to jump in on that? How about we go to Natalie, talking about universal basic income?
Okay. Yes. I mean, I think Lloyd's absolutely right that the financial crash, we didn't have the slogan "Build Back Better" then, but there was a kind of feeling around that. But what was lacking really was the vision of what it looked like. And I think this time we have much clearer pictures around, you can call it the Green New Deal. I don't really care what you call it, but there's an understanding that we're both at a medical crisis, but we're also in a continuing economic crisis. We really haven't recovered from the economic crisis of 10 years ago. We're, of course, in an environmental crisis. The climate emergency is very much pressing down on us, and we're just breaking temperature records everywhere. We're right on the edge, and we're seeing, we've just seen a major coal mine massively write down its value. There's an understanding we have to see that transition. So there really is an opportunity now. And one of the things that COVID is very much delivered is, before as a Green, I was used to saying, we need to go net zero carbon in Britain by 2030. And, you get a patronising pat on the head of, but the world doesn't change that fast. You've got to allow decades for things to change. You can't make these things happen that quickly. We now understand that things can change like that when they have to. And if we look at the environment and we look at the state of inequality, the desperate state of the Uber driver who kept working when he was ill with COVID because he had no other way of financially surviving, we're in a profoundly unsustainable situation. We've been chasing after profits, what we've called efficiency. We have to go for resilience. And so we have to build something that looks much better. And the other positive coming out of the horror and the tragedy and the death of COVID is that lots of people have looked around and seen how things look different. The air doesn't smell of diesel fumes anymore. You can hear lots more birds. Either there's more birds around or you just isn't drowned out by the traffic noise. And people are saying, I don't really want to go back to commuting 2 hours a day with my face stuck in someone else's armpit on a horribly overcrowded train, and I can't. So there's both a will and understanding and a start of a vision of how things can be much better.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Chris, I saw your hand go up there. Would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, well, I suppose as a Liberal Democrat, I should be an optimist, but because you have to be if you're a Liberal Democrat. But actually, I'm the actual answer to the question. Yes, I would like it to change, and yes, I think lots of people will. But I am fearful that change will not happen in the way that it should. We have 4 years of the current government, and that's 4 out of the 10 years that the exam question gave us in terms of setting the direction. These 4 years are going to be the most important years of setting the trajectory that this country has to move in. And to date, it's not clear that the lessons that we should be learning are being learned. The Chancellor announced a green, or the Prime Minister announced a green industrial plan and put in £350 million. Of that, £10 million was for electric cars. France is putting in €8 billion, 10 times. It's an orders of magnitude differently. So unless the decisions made now understand the scale of the challenge that we really do face, then my worry is that we will miss the opportunity to set off in the right direction, not just in the right direction, but in the pace we need to change. We do need a green recovery. We do need different ways of measuring success. The GDP, the gross domestic product, which is the way in which growth is measured in this country, is a very limiting measure. And it is a measure that creates many of the problems that we are now living with. One final point is, I had to go to London this week. The traffic in London is as bad as it was before lockdown. That is not good. And people are moving back into the same patterns of behavior. And there isn't currently any leadership creating new patterns of behavior. The challenge at the moment, or it seems to be, is to get stuff back to the way it was before. And I don't think that's where we've got to go. So in the answer to Lloyd, who asked the question, I want it to change. I want us to take this opportunity, but I think it's up to all of us to make sure that we hold the government and other decision makers to account to deliver those changes.
And Mark, you had indicated that you wanted to come in on something.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'd like to sort of broaden, if you like, this sort of particular point to take into account societal changes as well. I mean, I think just on the green issues and the environment, I think it is incredibly important. And actually, although Nat and I don't necessarily agree on every piece of political ideology, actually, the one thing I think is really important is that we have a Green Party. And the Green Party acts as a conscience on us all, particularly people like me. And one thing I do spend quite a lot of time, and I have a regular meeting, is with climate change activists within Wild Forest. So I go and see once every 3 months or so, to sit down and discuss with them, kind of their views, because this is not the thing that's most important to me. The most important thing to me is economics, and that's kind of what I'm very interested in, and all the rest of it. But I do see that there are really, really important issues with climate change, and that's why, although I spend a lot of time reading about economics, I don't spend enough time following on the climate change stuff. So I'm very, very keen to engage as best I possibly can with all of that. But I think there are going to be a lot of fundamental changes that are going to happen within our society as we come up over the coming few months and years. And I think it's going to be potentially quite profound for Charlie and Will's and your colleagues' generations. One of the things we've been seeing is with the changes in information technology is shopping habits. So one of the things we're now losing is the high streets. Now, I think one thing that COVID-19 has done is they've now accelerated the closing down of the high street. We're seeing loads of people losing their jobs, loads of retail chains are closing down, and this is just going to accelerate what we knew was going to happen. We're also seeing this, people are now working from home. The fact that we're doing this now, if we were doing this last summer, we would all be sitting in your hall in Worcester talking to a group of people. Now we can have a far wider audience through technology. And whilst that's great, it also means that an awful lot of people who run service businesses, banks, investment managers, anything, lawyers, estate agents, that's now being done online. And it means a big difference for the use of office spaces. Now that's great because people are not going to be commuting that much anymore. But if you're a young sort of worker who's trying to establish your network, to try to get the right mentoring from people, to try to help you learn on the job and all that kind of stuff, you're not quite going to get it to the same extent that people like my generation have had in the past. So we have to think about what that means for your generation. That's really important. Looking even further forward, artificial intelligence and machine learning is going to really change how we operate in the manufacturing sectors. There's an awful lot of smart things which are happening. But if we talk about, Natalie mentioned the Uber driver who carried on working because when he had COVID-19 because he hadn't got an income. The reality of it is Uber are now spending huge amounts of money on driverless vehicles. So autonomous and driverless vehicles are going to be great. They're going to be electric. They're going to do, they're going to have a lot of effect on the environment. They're not going to be driving all over the place to go home and all that kind of stuff. You can park them up wherever you like. But what are we going to do with those drivers? And it's not just Uber drivers. It's lorry drivers. It's delivery drivers. Amazon are looking at delivering parcels by drones. So there's an awful lot of that type of thing which is going on. And then, of course, when we look at the economic crisis, the one interesting thing that's come out of the economic crisis is, although it was driven largely as subprime debt and problems with the mortgage markets, we saw a drop in property prices, but we're now back to where we were before. Property prices, Charlie and Will, for your generation, are still going to be 8 or 9 times average earnings. And that is an incredibly difficult thing to try to achieve. So listen, I don't want to depress you guys. You sort of smile on your face is good. But it's but there are I think we're probably in your generation going to go through more profound change. We've already started it with the internet and the advances in information technology. But I think this is going to be far deeper and far more societal than perhaps we imagine. And I think within that, we are going to see sort of quite strong leaps forward. I think, getting back to, I suppose, finishing where I started, getting back onto the green issues, I think Greta Thunberg has become a voice of a generation. And I think, she's standing up and making these points, and actually increasingly the case that, I don't think we're handing the world over to your generation as well as it should have been. But I think your generation are pushing back much harder over how things are going to change. And part of that, and a significant part of that, involves climate action. And I think this is a good thing. And that's why, even though it's not the thing I know the most about, it's the thing that I do care deeply about. I've got 3 kids. I don't want them to grow up in a poisoned world.
No, it's really interesting stuff. And Jackie, you want to come in maybe there, just sort of what's your outlook for the next 10 years, but also focusing a bit on climate action. We've had a question come in from from Ted Pole, and he's asked, do you think COVID is a distraction from the real crisis of climate change?
No, Ted, I don't think it's a distraction. I think it's a real and serious problem that we have had to address as a country, and the impact of which we will see for very many years to come. However, what I don't think it should be is an excuse not to take action on climate in the way in which others have described. And actually, I share a little bit of Chris's depression because, frankly, I mean, just on a sort of micro level, I used to commute to Birmingham on the train, clutching my refillable cup for my coffee when I got to New Street Station. Now, of course, what I have to do is to drive and to use a unrecyclable single-use cup. Now, hopefully, that is a short blip and we will begin to be able to continue to make progress. But I'm not wholly optimistic about that. The second thing I would say is that I think we've seen some, in the sort of broader economic and business area, we've seen some pretty abysmal examples of how employers operate. The Uber example is a good one, but just some of the most significant small outbreaks of COVID have been where employers are essentially failing to protect their workers, expecting them to work very closely together, probably in some cases expecting them to live very closely together. And I think we need to reinvigorate our approach to decent work and the sort of standards that we expect employers to have for that. And where people are not living up to them, there has to be some sort of consequence for that. And then finally, given the reference back to 2008, let's not forget the response to the 2008 financial crash, certainly post-2010, was a policy of economic austerity. Well, if there's one good thing that's come out of COVID, that seems to have gone out of the window. Quite rightly, we have seen an enormous amount of money being spent on trying to mitigate the impact of COVID, particularly the economic impact as well as the health impact. I think the question now is, will there be a sort of shutting down of that spending again? Will all of a sudden austerity come back into fashion again? And when it comes to paying the bills, because the bills have to be paid, who will end up paying them? The fact that Rishi Sunak is already suggesting that departments should be looking at how they clamp down on public sector pay, that is, of course, the pay of the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, and the other key workers who kept us going through this pandemic, suggests to me that we may not yet have got the right answer as to who's going to pay and how we're going to maintain demand in the economy as we go forward.
Well, what alternative solution would you propose in terms of financing it, or just leave the debt for our generation?
Well, with interest rates as low as they are at the moment, to be honest with you, if you can borrow money without having to repay at significantly high rates, and you can use that to invest in the infrastructure of the country, and incidentally, that should also include more investment in education for the future of people of your generation, that strikes me as being an economically quite sensible thing to do.
So you're in favour of or at least broadly in favour of the government's infrastructure spending plans, or do you think they've been misdirected in terms of where the spending has been promised to be spent?
I think there have been some questions about whether or not it's always been focused in the right place, but I think it's quite, it was necessary to get quite a large amount of money out into the labour market quite quickly and into businesses, and I think that was the right thing to do. The question now, I think, is whether or not you row back on that, or whether you do take the opportunity perhaps to think about how we invest in education. I talked about childcare previously, I've talked about health, and that we don't only see infrastructure. I mean, I do want to see big capital infrastructure projects because I think they're important for the country, but I think there's other infrastructure as well, soft infrastructure around skills and the way in which we invest in our people, which I would also want to see prioritised.
Natalie, I wonder if we can maybe bring you in on some of the points made, but also we've just been talking a bit about infrastructure and sort of housing as well. We've had a question come in from Julia Letts. She's talking about how we'd like to see legislation that makes it compulsory for newly built houses to be built with features that would help that green revolution. Maybe you could just talk a little bit more about that argument whilst making your point you wanted to make.
Sure. Well, yes. I mean, the fact that we are building houses right now that immediately need to be retrofitted to meet any sort of modern standard is horrific. And there was the zero carbon home standard, which was supposed to come in 2015, that was pulled virtually at the last moment, to the horror of some of the better elements of the housing industry. And that would have meant that essentially every house in any sort of sensible position would have had solar panels on the roof, would have had decent levels of insulation and air tightness, etc. We are now finally moving in this direction. But 3/4 of the homes that exist now, 3/4 of the homes that people will be living in 2050 already exist now. So we need a massive program of retrofitting, far larger than the 2 billion that the government's announced. And if you look at Denmark, which already has far higher quality of homes, they're spending about 10 times as much as the government is on home energy efficiency. But of course, that also needs a huge amount of training and a huge amount of resources. And that means then money for small independent businesses all around the country. But I did just want to pick up on the question about is COVID a distraction from the climate emergency? Because actually, of course, they're two sides of the same coin. COVID is very much a product of our destruction of the natural world of biodiversity. It's a zoonoses coming from a wild animal. And we're going to see more of these things. More of them are threatened because we're destroying and interacting very closely with the natural world. And that ties in with the point that Mark made. He said, the most important thing to me is economics. And I really want to recommend a book to the people watching, Donut Economics, which basically makes the point that the economy is a complete subset of the environment. We exist within the natural world, both climate emergency, the destruction of biodiversity, bioabundance, plastics, destruction of fresh water and soils, all of those things mean ultimately, as the saying goes, there's no jobs on a dead planet. And that's the direction we're heading in. And living within the planet's physical limits is not politics, it's physics. And we're not doing that now, as Donut Economics demonstrates very clearly.
I can highly recommend Donut Economics. It's a very interesting read. Chris, Natalie, also you'd indicated you want to speak on that, so I'd like to introduce you on that too. We'd also like to ask what your thoughts are about universal basic income, which Natalie mentioned earlier, especially as it's something promised or pledged by both candidates or both leading candidates in the Lib Dem leadership election. So what are your thoughts on in the environment and UBI more generally?
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly it's going to be part of the public debate, and I think the challenge is, what do we mean by it? I think people mean different things by it, and by how much is it? And I'm happier, I have to say, with a universal basic services. I think there are basic things that individuals should expect from living in this country, and they're not getting them. And I think that's a great starting point. Universal basic income works if it's tied to a range of other things. I don't think it's something you can parachute into the economy as it currently sits without the skills essence that Jackie talked about, without some elements of localization and the way in which people take responsibility for their own lives. I think it's part of a much broader piece, and I'm sure that that's actually what we'll have in our manifesto. But the real point that too few people are getting their fair share of whatever's going on in this country is absolutely true. And finding better ways of delivering value to individuals, whether it's through a universal basic income, whether it's through universal services, or whether it's through some other means, has to be something that whichever political party is moving forward, they have to be able to offer. Simply saying we'll trickle it down from the top, which has been a traditional way of one side of politics, we know doesn't work. And necessarily nationalizing everything and hasn't worked either. So the UBI is a new way of looking at that. And I think it's a very good starting point for a wider debate about empowering individuals. And part of that is economic empowerment, but there's a much wider empowerment that needs to be associated with that. Just coming back on housing, I have a big worry about this week's announcement on housing, where standards, far from doing what Natalie would want them to do, are going to be eroded, far from having houses that are designed for the next 20 years. They're going to be actually designed for a Dickensian movie. So we really do need to ensure that the process that is going to sit behind these government changes, if they happen, delivers the sort of houses that people want to live in, not just this year, but in 10, 20 and 30 years time, and start to meet the challenge that that we all know has to be met.
Yeah, Mark, I wondered maybe if you had a reaction to some of those things about empowering people through economic policy, but also that housing, those housing plans that are going to be coming in next week. Are you fearful in a sort of rural constituency like yours, potentially, that there might be some upset surrounding some of the government's plans to sort of force local government to build a certain amount of homes every year?
Yeah, living in rural Worcestershire, I cannot imagine anything more unpopular with my neighbours and my family.
Jackie, you'd probably
building houses on the fields around us.
You'd probably agree as well, Jackie, from your time as an MP as well.
It sounds like Charlie and Will are going to be voting Conservative. It's by the reaction of some of my local councillors. Everybody agrees we've got to build more houses. Everybody agrees with that. Everybody agrees not in my backyard. And Jackie will know this from when she was the MP in Redditch. It's planning is just hideously problematic. It's incredibly difficult. And what we're trying to do, and I've got the document in front of me, which is the kind of the brief resume of what's going on in this. And just on the, Natalie, I mean, your point about the quality of these houses, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think it was the Committee on Climate Change raised some points on the previous stuff we were doing. Part of what we're undertaking is to review the roadmap to the future home standards to ensure that implementation takes place the shortest possible time, and that's the stated objective. Look, Natalie, you and I have been in politics long enough to know that that's kind of can be quite a wide feast, but I do think people are sort of pressing for better quality, better insulated homes. We are aiming for a net zero homes as soon as we can do it. But inevitably, of course, it comes back to the economic case. And one of these sort of interesting problems that we're having with the sort of the whole of our economy is, if you wind back to something as simple as the aviation sector. I mean, I think all of us would agree that the aviation sector is one of the hugely pollution. It sort of pumps out sort of huge amounts of carbon every time you fly a jet across the world. And yet the political difficulty that we all have is this whole issue of trying to work out what are we going to do with all those staff. British Airways are having a massive argument at the moment because they're trying to sort out a way they can keep some of them employed, and actually, kind of questionable whether they're doing the right thing about that. But it's we've got some big airlines that could potentially go bust, and whereupon all of those people who work for those airlines, even though they may agree entirely with Natalie and the Green Party and all the rest of us about the environment, their biggest priority is going to be their jobs and their livelihoods and paying the mortgage on these homes that we hope to build for them that are going to be good carbon zero homes. And this is the endless problem that it keeps coming round and round in circles. Is we all agree that the planet is the most important thing for us, but then economic reality hits us in the face, and until we completely change the economic model, it's going to be very difficult to bring about this sort of fundamental change. And the problem with the economic model is it's pretty much something we've been working on since 1776, when Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. And although we've occasionally tried different things in Venezuela or China or Russia, they kind of don't really work very well. Now, there's been some interesting points that people have made about where we are economically now. And actually, I think we're in actually quite a dangerous place. We've talked about the government debt, and its government debt now stands at £2 trillion. It's just a fraction over 100% of our GDP. There are various ways we can work our way out of this. We can either tax more, we can inflate our way out of it, so we sort of stop borrowing more. But having said that, we are going to be borrowing more. The interesting argument, which if you want to sort of start getting into the techie details of monetarist policy, but one of the interesting issues which people aren't really focusing on is quantitative easing, where of course quantitative easing is something which, for it to be QE and not money printing, has to be cancelable. But since 2008, when we started the QE program, we've increased it. And so this is essentially where the Bank of England artificially increases the amount of money in the system. It now stands at 730 billion. If we never cancel that QE, actually the government debt is not at over 100% of GDP. It's only about 65% of GDP. And this is one of the interesting arguments that are sort of going on amongst monetarists and what's going to happen with all of that. We've got, as I say, we've got an awful lot of weird things. We've got very, very, very rich people. I mean, we have some people in this country who are worth more than some nations out there. and yet we still have a massive problem with poverty. And I think we have to do more to try to level up the country as a catchphrase at the moment. We have to do more to get people into the housing ladder, to get people into profitable jobs, to stop having this north-south divide. And by the way, while we're at it, something I feel very passionately about is we can't stop in the UK. The Western world has a huge duty to support developing nations, and there are a lot of poor developing nations out there. And I chair the thing called the Conservative Friends of International Development, but it is something which is really important to us, that we have got to be helping nations develop and become trading partners. There's more to think about now than ever before.
We will be moving on to international relations.
Yeah, just Natalie, you had really quickly, you said you wanted to come back on something.
Okay, just really quickly. I mean, Marx said, this economic system has been going since the 18th century, and there's been many changes in that, but that's all being built on growth. And there's the practical reality of the finite limits of the planet. You can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. And that's where really, there's very little difference at the moment between the Labour and the Tory party. They're both suggesting that the pie, somehow or other, we've got to make the pie get bigger, and then the people getting crumbs get a few more crumbs. The pie cannot get bigger. We've got to slice the pie up much more fairly. And that means, profound structural change in the economy with UBI, with like a 4-day working week as standard, with no loss of pay. We've created a deeply unhealthy society. The epidemic of mental ill health we've got, the insecurity of so many people's lives, the massive reliance on food banks. So, what we're doing now isn't working. So we really have to go to a different model. And that model has to be one that says everyone has enough for a decent life within the limits of this planet. And how do we get there? One of the answers has to be democracy. I mean, Mark referred to the level of very rich people. And, we get the politics that those very rich people pay for through funding political parties, particularly one particular political party. And we have a government that won the backing of 44% of 44% of people who voted Tory, yet they got the 100% of the power. So, what do we need to change? We need to change the economic system, but we also need to make Britain a democracy. And then we can make the changes, those sets of changes, economic and democratic, go together.
Well, thank you very much for that. And we will move on to talking about constitutional change and international relations, both of which brought up there if we have time. But there's been a sort of great expression of people wanting to talk about education, especially younger members of our audience. So this is one for anyone in the panel, really, which is one of the major problems with closing schools has been that the education gap between poorer and wealthier students has been exacerbated, especially evidenced by on Tuesday when the Scottish results came out, the fact that almost arbitrarily, it would seem, poorer students' results have been downgraded far more than their wealthier counterparts. This is a problem that's only going to get worse in the next year as COVID continues to have an impact. What steps could be taken to prevent the socioeconomic divide in education getting larger? Yeah. Jackie, can we go to you on that one?
Okay. Thank you, with my former teacher's hat on. And also one of the things I do now is to chair a trust that is responsible for children's social care. And I've been enormously worried during the COVID period and the schools being, well, of course, schools actually, of course, haven't been closed, have they? Teachers have been working throughout the whole of this period, supporting the children of key workers and trying to support very vulnerable children. But the truth is that the people who will have had the most education during this time period will have been those people from stable family backgrounds where they've been able to be homeschooled, where they've had access to IT, and those people who've been able to or have been willing and happy to get their children into school. So the people who have lost out, the children who've lost out on education are the children who most needed it to help to close the gap between what their family and socioeconomic backgrounds leaves them with and what others have got. So I was disappointed, for example, that it wasn't possible to have a larger opening of schools before the summer break. And I think actually if the government had put its heads together properly with local authorities and with head teachers in particular, they could have come up with a plan that would have enabled us to do that. And of course, I also do some work with the Children's Commissioner, and she yesterday, of course, rightly said, actually that what we need to do if necessary, is to focus much more on schools and getting children back to school than we do. Once again, I sound as if I'm obsessed with pubs, but once again, rather than getting people back into pubs, I would much rather that we had focused on that. That's going to be the short-term thing. Then we're going to need to find some ways, therefore, to right that imbalance. Specialised tutoring facilities, for example, for the children who've missed out the most. Supporting teachers to identify those and have smaller groups and to really focus on them, probably for a year or 18 months. And the government has put some money into that, but I think it's going to need even more focus on that. And of course, thank goodness, there are children who may have been going hungry during these summer holidays that now don't need to, not thanks to the efforts of the government, but thanks to the efforts of Marcus Rashford, an extremely impressive young man. And I say that as an Aston Villa fan.
Chris, I think you said you wanted to come in on that. And also, would you accept as well then that, as Jackie said, there is going to have to be that trade-off with reopening schools where we're probably going to have to see certain things like pubs and restaurants closing and in order for schools to open safely?
Well, I don't know if that's the trade-off, but the priority should be for schools to open. And we cannot go on with schools not open. So therefore, we have to think, I'm not a scientist who works out the equation, but for schools to open, if there has to be a quid pro quo, then that should be done. And when schools do go back, I think that there's going to be a number of school students who've got out of the habit of going to school. They've got out of the habit of school behaviour, and there mustn't be a wave of exclusions and suspensions that follows this, because there will be difficulties reintegrating some school students back into the school life, and that needs to be taken into consideration. And the teacher's job will be made even harder by these kind of challenges. There's also the challenge of students who've completely dropped off the radar. I was talking to a teacher friend, and she was saying, well, we've been able to get into touch with all bar 4 of our students. She's talking about a year group. She said, but there are 4 of them we just can't trace. Well, 4 out of a year group, let's say it was a year group of 80, that's quite a lot of kids in percentage terms. And so there's those issues of following up. Who is going to follow up? Where is the resource to follow up? The school doesn't have the resource to chase into a housing estate or indeed the power to do it. So I think there needs to be a serious amount of thought sitting down now, and I'm hoping that the Department for Education, and Mark can tell me that it is having this thought, is also putting the resources in to do things like Jackie talked about, which is tutoring and after school clubs and all things like that. Yeah. In the end, I think universities are going to have to change their expectations for this particular cadre of students. We mustn't permanently stigmatize them or permanently knock them back. We have to accept that some of them will be temporarily knocked back, but we must make that a temporary thing and make sure that all the allowances are made and all the understanding is made of the socioeconomic issues that have been going on for many of these young people.
Yeah, I mean, they're really important points. And Natalie, you said you wouldn't come in on that. We've also had a question which maybe you could answer, give what you think is the answer to that, Natalie, as well, from Sarah, saying, how will COVID-19 affect the job prospects of young adults leaving university in the next decade? So, I mean, that's another really important question there.
Very much so. But to start with the education gap and the question, I very much want to agree with Chris about the issue of making sure that there's allowances made in terms of behaviour. And we have seen huge problems with exclusion. And, I'm talking to you from Sheffield, and there's a very clear path of exclusion leading to crime, leading to knife crime, leading to death. I'm not exaggerating at all here. And so it's really important. And one of the things is that, we've seen varying messages from the government about how much when schools go back, there'll be the focus on narrowing the curriculum, teaching to the test, trying to hothouse people through, push people through. And, our schools have been turned into exam factories where pupils are shoved through exam after exam after exam. And of course, some have been spat out the sides while doing that. And we're also going to have a group of people coming back into schools with, I was referring to our mental health epidemic of mental ill health, which was there before COVID. This has been an enormously stressful, difficult time. People have been crowded into small homes. One of the things that I hope the government is now regretting is the bedroom tax, forcing siblings to share a bedroom. And if you think about what that's like under lockdown and how difficult that is, and people in smaller houses. So, we need actually, a focus on creative subjects, the focus on subjects that will allow people to come to terms with what's happened to them, to think critically about what's happened, not a kind of sausage machine shoved through exams kind of approach. And in terms of the job prospects, I was actually on a call this morning with a very impressive young man who's sort of running a group that really tries to help young people work out how they can create their own job, their own role in life, how they can work to change society. And this kind of ties and goes back to universal basic income, because increasingly the idea that you can go out and get a job for life and do the right subject at university and that will prepare you is just clearly a fiction. What we need to do is, from universities, from schools, is people who are prepared to keep learning, lifelong learning. I shared this week, there was a wonderful story out of Italy of a 96-year-old who finally graduated from university at 96. So lifelong learning should be available there at all the way along. And you need the foundation of security of always knowing, being able to put food on the table, keep a roof over your head. And that might mean you can then start a social enterprise, as a young person in your community, perhaps to work with the people who are going the wrong way and falling towards the knife crime. You start the social enterprise that creates the job that helps those young people. It's a win-win all round. It's going to be a different kind of thing to, okay, I'm going to apply for that graduate scheme. Off I go, that's my career for the next 20, 30, 40 years. The world is just not going to be like that. And people need a foundation of security behind that to make that happen. Otherwise, inequality will get even worse, because those who've got a bank of mum and dad to rely on will be able to find the path. Those who don't will just get stuck.
So I suppose you said there is interesting about young people no longer necessarily being able to choose a degree for life, or the right degree for them. And bring this into Mark, by saying the government has been sort of very determined upon, at least in their rhetoric since Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, in targeting humanities degrees and sort of almost going back on, I suppose it was originally Tony Blair's commitment to 50% of students going to university. Do you agree with at least what the government is talking about doing, which is discouraging useless humanities courses and encouraging fewer people to go to university?
Oh God, I hope not, because my son is getting his A-level results next week and he wants to go to UCL to read history. Good luck with that.
Good luck to
actually, you've opened up a really interesting avenue on this one. I was going to come back on some of these other points, but actually this is very, very interesting. One of the any economy as it develops needs to become more and more productive and needs to make more and more money per individual in order for standards of living to people to maintain their standards of living and grow. And that's, again, that goes back to sort of, I can see Natalie's shaking her head vehemently in the background, but it's but again, we are going to carry on disagreeing on this point. But it's but actually you want your economy to get better, and the only way you can really do it is by increasing the skills and increasing research and all of that important stuff. The problem is that what I fear is that what's happened is that universities have stopped being areas or seats of research and learning and all the rest of it, and now to a certain extent become marketing enterprises selling a product. And now it costs £9,500 a year to go to a university. And if you create this idea that a university education is the only way you can really get on in life, you're now opening up this fabulous marketplace for universities to sell all sorts of different courses. Now, there is absolutely no question that there are courses which you have to have to proceed in your career. So engineering degrees, really important for what we're doing in terms of manufacturing, carbon composites, all that kind of stuff. Medicine, you've got to have a degree in medicine in order to be a consultant, and you've got a epidemiologist. All of these sort of people do incredibly important jobs. And what happens is, because there is quite a lot of subsidy that goes into this, society is is kind of starting off by subsidizing this. The taxpayer is subsidizing this in order to get them started. The problem is, if your university is growing ever larger pace, it needs to sell more courses, and you run out of people who want to do those courses, or indeed the demand from your wider country to do those high value courses. So you start doing this proverbial golf course management or photography courses, degree courses, which really are not something that's ever needed a degree. Now the problem is, and this is where the economics of it go completely cockeyed, is what we're doing is the student loan system works on the basis that you pay your £27,500 and you then repay it once you reach certain thresholds. Now the problem is, if you have a degree that doesn't provide you with a job that reached that threshold, eventually you, after 30 years, you don't have to pay back what's left. So the irony of the whole thing is you're selling degrees to people that don't need them. It puts them in debt and therefore puts them under stress. And in the end anyway, the wider economy repays that back for a degree that it didn't really want in the first place. And if it did want it, it would have, you would have paid the people who had that degree more money to do it. And meanwhile, those people who do well, say in medicine or in engineering or I suppose accountancy, all of those do get paid back early on. So you're sort of kind of kickstarting it, and actually the money is being directed in the wrong place for the greater good. I think the intention of it was sound. And I can remember, going out on the doorstep campaigning against this at the time when it was coming in at £3,500 a year, thinking it was completely outrageous. But then we were going from a situation where you had very few people going to universities and wanted to expand it, the amount of people getting that opportunity. So you've got quite a lot of sort of weird things going on within this that don't quite stack up. And I think we need to have a think about what it is we want out of our universities. Now, having coming back to the humanities thing, actually, personally, I think when we study history and we study culture and geography and all that kind of stuff, actually, I do think they have a value. I think they make our society that much richer, and they make us a better and a more interesting world to live in. So I do see that they are good, but I think there are some degrees where I just think people are being sold something they just don't need and don't want. And there have been some studies where people have looked at some people who've taken some of these degrees, and they've said, look, actually, if you take this money and you put it into, let's say, property instead of into a degree, you're actually better off having that money than you would be if you had some of these degrees which just don't pay very well. So there you go. Natalie's shaking her head again vehemently. So I'm fascinated to hear what you've got to say.
Well, just before maybe we go to Natalie, just Chris, you said you wanted to come in on some things that Mark and the other panelists were saying on this topic.
Yeah, well, I was going to come in, but then Mark made his powerful repudiation of the market and growth. So he's almost done it for me. But it's this idea that the single imperative is growth. The single imperative for any government should be to extend the meaningful lives of the people who live within the country of that government. And
so
I
mean
lives not spent lives spent not in morbid ill health, because one of the things that is happening is that people are living longer, but they're living longer in morbidity. So the measure of why we do things and what we do should be measured on that basis. One of the things that has helped that over time has been sensible growth. It is by far and away not the only thing, and it should not be the single measure by which we seem to keep coming back, the economic growth. There has to be a health of the nation measure, and there has to be, and that should be the number one thing. And well-being and happiness is part of that formula. And I think here I find myself in agreement with the Greens, and I think they've said this, and I've certainly keep saying it. We have to move away from the growth is all mandate, because it isn't.
Now, I know Natalie has very strong things on this, but very, very, very quickly, and then we're going to move on to
our... All right, well, just very quickly on what Mark said. The economy doesn't want the degree, therefore it's not paying for it. That assumes that university education is for the economy. University education demonstrably makes people more productive citizens. It makes them better parents. It makes them more informed voters, more able to make decisions in a democracy. So the idea that a university education is for the economy, I believe, is profoundly and utterly flawed.
I know we've got some.
Can I just say, I tend to agree with Natalie, but I'd just be very careful about not suggesting that people that don't go to university can't be good parents.
Absolutely. I was having the same feeling as you were saying that, Natalie.
And I didn't go to university, Natalie, so I am not a lesser person than you, even though I'm a commoner in the House of Commons.
But of course, you know, potentially, if you had the opportunity to spend time learning and thinking, maybe you belong to a different party.
You're going to be a 96-year-old graduate, Mark. You're going to be a 96-year-old graduate.
I'll have to go to university. Charlie and Will are trying to get control of their webinar.
No, don't worry, this is great. This is a proper discussion.
Exactly,
now.
yeah.
No, but I mean, Jack is right. I've spent a lot of time trying to promote apprenticeships. And there are lots of cases where apprenticeships are a much better way of equipping young people for a worthwhile future. Now, whether that job is for life or otherwise, gaining skills in a broader sense than just university skills is something that everybody benefits from. And in many cases, not all cases, and not one is not better than the other, but there are many jobs, roles, and individuals where apprenticeships are absolutely the right thing to do, where they are good quality apprenticeships and where they're properly supported by the employer.
No, it's a really interesting point. So we've nearly come to the end of the panel discussion, but just sort of one final topic, more just one final question. A lot of people have been asking about the sort of state of the Union, state of the United Kingdom, maybe the possibility that Scotland might want independence again. And I just wondered if we could maybe ask maybe all the panelists what their opinion is on how politics in the United Kingdom could potentially be impacted and potentially never look the same again as a result of the pandemic and as a result of our response.
Okay, I'm going to Jackie on this one first. Do you think the union will have a tough time because of the COVID pandemic in the next few years?
Well, I think there are several things over the last 18 months that have caused enormous pressures to the union. The pandemic is one of them. Brexit is another one. The failure of the Prime Minister to properly understand the impact on the nations of the United Kingdom, I think has been a significant problem. I want the union to continue. I think we are stronger as a union. But if in terms of where I want to see some more development is I think actually we need to see greater focus on regional and local government in England as well, because Chris was talking earlier on about how local government has been hollowed out. I think actually increasingly the way in which we take decisions at a regional and a local level will be a really important part of our politics. And I'd like to see that, not just in terms of money, in terms of powers as well. I'd like to see that boosted up.
And a quick question on that, Jackie, for you, and I suppose Natalie as well. Can the left or Labour ever win a general election without Scottish seats?
It's not easy. I think we were pretty close to it in 1997, if I remember rightly. But I mean, I hope you're not accusing me of instrumentalism in supporting the union, i.e. that I only support it because I want a Labour government. I actually think it is the right. I think we are a better, stronger country with devolved responsibility to nations, but overall a UK, and that's why I support it.
But do you think it will be increasingly difficult in the next few years, looking forward to 2024, for the Labour Party to win a majority in the House of Commons without being able to rely on seats in Scotland?
Well, it's true that unless we start doing better in Scotland and incidentally in other parts of England, and we get back to having 3 Labour MPs in Worcestershire, which we had when I was first elected to Parliament, including in your seat, Mark, then Labour is not going to get back into government. And that's the massive task for Keir Starmer. But I'm very pleased that he's there doing it.
I'm sure that the 6 Conservative Worcestershire MPs are quaking in their boots. Mark, as a Conservative and Unionist, you raised your hand earlier, I think, on that.
Yeah, well, yeah. Look, I mean, it's very interesting actually. The before the last election, just to follow on your point, beating up on Jackie about Scotland. But interestingly, if you got rid of Scotland, actually Labour would do better, as indeed because you would lose 59 seats, and if you've got a very small number, and you kept all the seats you had in England and and Northern Ireland and sorry, England and Wales, you do proportionally better. Look, my honest, candid opinion is I think that Scotland will get its independence. I think the only thing that's stopping it is putting off trying to have putting off a referendum. I think when I talk to my colleagues who are MPs in Scotland or very close to the Scottish border, they notice a very, very subtle but a very profound change in what's going on up there. It talks very much about itself. The media is very Scottish centric in a way that it wasn't a few years ago. Scotland is increasingly beginning to see itself independent anyway. It's reported independent, it's treated independently. It's really, I genuinely think, very, very sadly, by the way, that I think we may, this may be a battle that we're not going to win. It may not be for 5, 10, 20 years that we have the next referendum. But I think when the next referendum happens, which I think inevitably it will do at some point, then Scotland will go. And I think it's a great tragedy. I think the United Kingdom is a terrific conglomeration of lots of different people with different views and different life experiences and different skills. And I think we are so much stronger to better. I was also campaigning on the Remain side of the European referendum. I see that unions of one form or another, either closely packed unions like the United Kingdom or slightly looser unions like the European Union, or even looser unions like the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, they tend to work better together. But look, when it comes to the European Union, I campaigned hard, was out there doing as best I possibly could, but I lost the argument. And we have to move forward. 65% of my constituents voted to leave the European Union, and I think as I say, that feeling is going on in Scotland. So we need to put it together. Anyway, getting back to how many Labour MPs there are in Worcestershire, I have to say my Labour predecessor David Locke is an astonishingly nice bloke who I still keep in touch with, and he's a professional in the legal services, and he helps out very often actually when I ask him. And so the one thing I would say is we all, across the political divide, get on extremely well with each other. We differ in our political views, but the one thing that I would say, actually, that since I've been a member of Parliament for the last 10 years, is that I don't think I've ever come across anybody who I'm not 100% guaranteed or assured of their sincerity, that they are there to work for the benefit of the communities they serve. As I say, we differ on how to do that best, but everybody in the House of Commons, and I'm sure everybody in the House of Lords too, is really, really committed to that. It's really important to remember. Natalie, come on, and Chris, come and back me up there.
Well, I'd say that many people in the House of Lords, probably the majority, are absolutely there as public servants and working hard as best they can at the moment under quite difficult circumstances. So yes, and certainly when it comes down to the people who do the scrutiny of legislation, as Natalie will uphold, sitting down and spending literally hundreds of hours climbing through the bills that you people at the other end have sent our way, is quite a mind-numbing exercise, having done it on many occasions. Can I just carry on? And I just wanted to say is that the state of the nation question. I mean, I think one of the things that Boris or perhaps Cummings got right in terms of their messaging during the general election was that there was a great split and a great dissatisfaction across the country. And the narrative and the way in which they fed that was a very successful message that resonated with a number of people who would traditionally have voted for Jackie's party rather than Mark's. However, the proof of the success of that is what happened subsequently and how successful the Conservative government is in meeting those dissatisfactions, because I think the State of the Union is in a perilous state, and not just the Union in terms of the countries of the United Kingdom, but also the regions and the areas within England, as Jackie said. So it's going to be very important that the government, having stoked up expectation, actually is able to deliver on some of that expectation within the English regions, and I fear that they may not, which will make matters worse when it comes to some of the arguments that we have with our neighbours. Now, we got all this way without mentioning Brexit, and then we go and spoil it.
I know.
So close.
It's just been a joyous 6 months without it.
The interesting feature of, clearly we have left the European Union. When we leave the transition zone at the end of this year, unless something quite remarkable happens between now and then, and there's no sign of it, there will be an awful lot of economic fallout, and the majority of that economic fallout will fall on the very people that I was just talking about, the people whose expectations have been raised, and some of it will be blamed on COVID, some of it will be blamed on perfidious France. There'll be all sorts of blames going on, but in the end, Brexit will cause problems for the very people who are least able to handle those problems because of other things. And finally, on the union, I think I probably do agree with Mark that at the moment there's an inevitable course, and it's inevitable because the way the British government, Westminster, treats Edinburgh. For example, they signed a trade deal with the Faroe Islands without consulting the Scottish Parliament or the Scottish government. How can you do that? Well, they did it because they don't think the Scottish government is important. Well, if you treat a whole country of people with that degree of contempt, what do you expect? And that's the problem. There is no mutual respect between Westminster and Edinburgh. And as long as that goes on, it is fueling the fire of independence.
I mean, Natalie, I saw you sort of nodding during what Chris just said, but also, do you think that there is generally, through devolved institutions, devolved parliaments throughout the United Kingdom, a problem where people in maybe the party in Westminster doesn't have respect for those devolved institutions? And sorry, to give you the final word, what's your opinion on the State of the Union?
Okay, well, I mean, yes, I absolutely agree. There's a huge problem that Westminster doesn't treat what are actually far more democratic structures elected through variations of proportional representation, and far closer to the actual people concerned. There is a huge lack of respect. I mean, in terms of the State of the Union, the fact that I used to be leader of the Green Party of England and Wales tells you something. Our Scots went independent in 1990, and the Scottish Greens, are an independent party advocating for independence, and we back them in that. But I think we haven't really brought up Northern Ireland, and Jackie brought up Brexit, and there is huge issues with that border down the middle of the Irish Sea, and the impacts. Chris was talking about Northern Ireland is already a very poor area of the United Kingdom, and the impacts on Northern Ireland are going to be potentially enormous and hugely disruptive. And Chris also mentioned, a lot of what we do in the House of Lords is mind-numbing. And so I'll try and skip very lightly over something terribly mind-numbing, which is the Great Britain internal market. And this is another case where the Westminster government is utterly tromping all over devolved administrations and their rights and the Constitution. But I think, underlying all of this, and I'm going to disagree with Chris on a point he made a long time ago, which was he said when the next election happens in 2024, I don't think we're going to see stability suddenly break out in British politics after 5 years when we've had 3 elections and a referendum. We're in a profoundly unstable situation at the moment. I think the Tory party is profoundly unstable. The country is very unhappy and likely to get much unhappier. And I'm going to make another book recommendation, Steinringen, Nation of Devils.
I have that one, I'm afraid.
Well, you can look up for that one. It has the virtue of being really short. It's only a really small book, which is, when people recommend books, you always hope that's the way. But he basically wrote about the US and the UK a decade ago and said they were ungovernable and their systems were totally dysfunctional. And he's a Norwegian guy who, has worked for the UN and just looked around the world and said, God, what a mess. And, if you look at going back to where we started from in terms of COVID, 2 of the countries that have managed the whole COVID situation least well are majoritarian systems, the US and the UK, systems where they have genuinely governments that operate by a large degree of consensus, where they have coalitions, where they bring in large parts of society, whereas I think it was Chris
where they have women leaders. Where they have women leaders, Natalie.
Women leaders is a factor too, but if you compare New Zealand which is very much like our system, Westminster system. They chose to go to proportional representation. They have a different kind of politics. They have much more respect for their leaders, much more trust in their leaders. And when it comes to the crunch, that really matters. So we have an antique constitution developed by accident over centuries. It's broken. And Scotland leaving is probably going to be part of the process of fixing that.
I think we have to start winding up now. I'm sure, Jackie, that Mark will respond to your comments about women leaders by saying that it's still 2-0 to him on that front. But yes, thank you very much for all coming. It's been a pleasure to have you on. I hope you all enjoyed it. Before we go, I want a one-word answer from all of you, although I think I know what the answer might be from all of you. But Biden or Trump, Chris?
Sorry?
Biden or Trump?
Well, I'll tell you what I hope. Biden.
Yeah. Natalie?
Biden.
Jackie?
Biden.
Mark?
Biden.
Oh, good.
I can tell you, I predicted Trump at the last election.
Oh wow, so it must be Biden then.
Chris, was that a prediction or just what you wanted?
It was a bet. I put money on it.
But thank you very much. I'm glad we had consensus on one issue at the end there. But it's been fascinating to have you on, and thank you so much for doing it. And thank you to everyone at their homes across the UK. And we also have viewers in America and India, actually. So thank you everyone watching this. We hope you found it informative and interesting. And thank you for all the questions.
So I just want to say thank you very much again from me and to all the panelists. And if you're interested in seeing maybe more panel discussions in the future, maybe subscribe to the YouTube channel. I've got to do a plug, so subscribe to the YouTube channel, and maybe we should revisit this in 6 months and see whether some of the, and the For Many podcast with Jackie. I saw Ian's face. I saw his face appearing. Listen to Jackie's podcast as well to hear more as well. So thank you very much, everyone. And I hope you've enjoyed this stream. So thank you.
Thank you, and good luck to Mark's son.
Good luck, and good luck to you, Will.
Thank you.
Charlie, rather. Yeah.